It is just with utter pleasure and delight that I welcome back to campus Julius Genachowski, who has served here in the fall, and I think this is still a continuation of this, as the inaugural professor of leadership here, and who exemplifies leadership across sectors. His public service, well known, I think, to most of you, most recently as the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, but he's also served in other capacities, not only of the FCC, but also in the Supreme Court, and his work in the private sector, absolutely at the top. And a leader, someone who understands entrepreneurship, somebody who understands innovation, somebody who understands quickly changing technologies. Jonathan Zittrain, our own rock star, who is, the only person I know who actually effortlessly bridges the worlds of law, technology, policy, and making sense. He's the only one. They decided to wear no tie today to match me, but the truth of the matter is the most interesting thing that's going to happen is when I sit down and they get to talk. So thank you all for being here.
Well, thank you so much, Martha, and I'm excited to be here because Julius is one of my favorite people, and among all the other things that Martha said about Julius, all true, I'd add that Julius is one of the most extraordinary strategic thinkers I've ever met. I've gone head-to-head with Julius in poker and lived to regret it, and I think you're among those who say that there are larger lessons to be deployed, and that strategic thinking is one of the key.
And I think your lowering of expectations right now for our next poker game is, don't think I didn't notice that.
Touché. So I thought to get us started, it would be great to just chart your path a little bit.
Sure.
And how you scaled the mountain. So Brookline born.
Brookline born.
Go Red Sox for life.
Good, Brookline born, yeah. My father, both of my parents are immigrants. And they came here pretty soon after they moved to the US. They were both Holocaust survivors. My father had more harrowing experiences. And my dad ended up, after the war, moving to Israel and then coming here to the US to study engineering, first at RPI, then at MIT. And I was born while he was at MIT. This becomes relevant later. Maybe we'll come back to it. But yeah, I started here.
And with Passover season just having ended, would you categorize yourself as dutiful child or rebellious child?
You know, definitely rebellious child.
Who would have guessed?
Yeah. And it was interesting. My parents had just come from this really challenging experience, and they succeeded in the sense that they escaped from the torment of Europe during World War II. They had nothing. They came to the US, which offered the American dream. They then were able to take advantage of it. My father got a good job, and they were able to send their kids to good schools. My early yeshiva education isn't what really made me go wrong. It was it was going to Columbia for college that, well, it didn't actually start a little bit earlier. I was a voracious reader, but it caused me to question a number of the things that my parents had sacrificed so much for in order to give their children the opportunities that we had. So there were many pretty intense discussions and debates around the home. Probably healthy, but not without its difficulties.
Uh-huh. Well, while we're thinking of college, I know, for instance, university right now is contending with a divestment petition around fossil fuels. I'm curious if you faced any similar issues from the student side of things at Columbia.
Yeah, that's funny. It's, and it's such a long time ago, but things do repeat themselves. So I was class of 1985 at Columbia College, and one of the big issues of the day involved universities' investments in companies that were doing business with South Africa. And I agreed with the students who thought that there was no reason that universities need to invest in businesses that were doing business in the apartheid regime in South Africa. And so I did join up with the students who protested at Columbia. And the protests in those days got relatively serious. There were sit-ins at faculty buildings. And
I love this use of the passive voice here. Did you sit in?
I sat in. I sat in. I also I did a couple of things. All right, so I sat in. I didn't sleep in. And many students who had more fortitude than I did spent the night, and I just needed to get my sleep. And so out of guilt, I decided that I would write some songs that could be performed to the people who had, and so I did. And so I wrote a couple of songs. I played guitar at the time, and I wrote a couple of songs. These are names you won't remember. I borrowed a song that Phil Oakes had written called "I've Got Something to Say, Sir, and I'm Going to Say It Now." And I wrote some lyrics that were relevant to divestment. And so I did that. The statute of limitations is what?
You're past it.
All right, good. Yes. The other thing that happened in college was I was very active in student journalism in college. And I wrote a series that got a lot of attention in the university on what we called administrative waste, wasteful spending by university administration at a time when tuition was rising and need-blind admissions policies were under attack. And I just wrote the stories. I was a journalist. It did not make the university particularly happy, and there came a point when the editor of the Columbia Daily Spectator and I were summoned to the office of the president of the university and encouraged to think differently. We kept on writing our stories. I think they had a positive influence.
Before we leave that topic, just now, given all that has transpired between then and now, what strategic advice would you offer if Drew Faust were to say, I have this petition in front of me, they want Harvard to divest out of here, out of the fossil fuels?
Yeah.
How would you think about that?
I think, and this is something, I certainly saw a lot of this in government and politics. You see a lot of this in business. I would, and this isn't advice to her, but just in general, reserving judgment early and thinking about what kind of process to run that enables both the decision maker and the community to think through the issues. Process can be really boring, but can also be really important both in getting to the right answer, whatever the right answer is, and in also giving people broadly a sense of participation and ownership in it. I definitely saw when I was at the FCC, that was a job where it was impossible to make decisions that would make everyone happy. And you couldn't avoid that dilemma by not making decisions because that would make people unhappy. And I did find that a couple of things really helped avoid dysfunctionality and increase functionality at an agency like the FCC. And one was process, running inclusive, open, participatory processes. And then two, particularly as a decision maker, accepting the obligation at the end of the day to not only make a decision, but explain why you're making it in terms that can be broadly understood. We used to have a test when I was at the FCC. We were dealing with a lot of complex topics, a lot of technical topics, a lot of economics, a lot of this and a lot of that. And my own personal test was that we really weren't done with our process until those of us at the table at the very end could explain what we had decided and why we had decided it in just a few sentences. And that's a good test for whatever you do, I think, to impose that discipline on yourself, the process and the clear explanation. I learned that, by the way, I've learned that from many people, and I've had such great mentors in my life. Dean Minow, who was one of my professors at here, and both on the process and in the clear explanation. I think you were probably one of the very first people to teach me that. And I learned that both from people who are incredibly not like each other in many ways. I don't think they've met. I think they would like each other. Justice Souter, who I was lucky enough to clerk for, and it was really such a wonderful experience with him because he just felt this powerful need to explain why he was taking the position that he took, and it would go deep with him, both the high level and then at each point. And that was very powerful. He would, as his clerk, insist that you do the same. But I learned a lot from watching how he exercised his responsibilities as a decision maker. And another was Barry Diller. I worked for Barry Diller for a number of years at a company called IAC Interactive Core. When I was there, the company owned a bunch of internet and media businesses like Expedia and Ticketmaster and Hotels.com and TripAdvisor and USA Network and Sci-Fi Channel. Same kind of thing. I remember one of the very first words that I heard Barry talk about a lot in my early days working for him was process. And then also, I think he's someone who, like Justice Souter, accepts this obligation as a decision maker to be able to explain. Even though, like some of us, he's an intuitive decision maker. But at the end of the day, he won't do anything important until he can sit there and explain it, to you and you and you, and on CNBC and on other places. And it's a great discipline to put oneself through.
This is a remarkably or non-cynical view of the relationship between decision makers and the people who are affected by it, refreshingly so. I wonder how much it's universally shared in circles in which you found yourself. And one part of your path that we haven't mentioned yet is time spent working with the Iran-Contra Investigatory Committee. I don't know if you're what you found there and how it might relate to the sense that decision makers are generally well positioned and doing their work properly if they're trying to get to the right answer, explaining it in a lucid way,
yeah,
et cetera, et cetera.
So there are a couple of topics to talk about here. I'll mention them, but then I'll tell you a story. This topic of when you take what we were just talking about before, process, inclusion, and obligation to explain, and then you layer on national security and secrecy, it gets very complex. So let's maybe come back and talk about that a little bit. But I'll just tell you a funny story. Just as the Iran-Contra job was one of my very first jobs pre-law school, out of college. And how many people remember the Iran-Contra committee in this room?
Wow. How many people have heard of the Iran-Contra affair? Okay, that's...
So this was a very big deal in the last century, and for a moment in time, the President of the United States was Ronald Reagan during that period, and it was a very odd thing because there were two somewhat unusual foreign policy things that came together under one heading. The U.S. government was secretly aiding the Contras in Nicaragua, notwithstanding a congressional law that said they can't. And then at the time, there were U.S. hostages in Iran, and there were efforts, of course, to try to release them. Some of those efforts involved trading arms for hostages. And then these two things got linked, both because the same people were working on them, and then also because there was a money flow between the two of them. So a special congressional committee was appointed to investigate this. It had substantial powers. It was all put together very quickly. And in one of the many instances of coincidence and good luck that led to me having fun jobs, someone I met at the YMCA in Washington, D.C., in DuPont Circle, I was working for Chuck Schumer at the time, said, hey, we're looking for someone on the Iran-Contra committee staff. Do you want to come work there? I said, okay. And so I was totally bottom of the totem pole, came in, it was a small staff. At the time, there were no, on the House side, it was a joint committee, but I was technically working for the House staff. There were no SCIFs in the House. What's a SCIF? A SCIF is a secure compartmented
information
facility, right? So it's a facility that's secured enough that you're allowed to have top secret classified documents. They didn't have them at the time. And so instead they put this committee staff in this wonderful place. It was under the dome of the Capitol, up on the third floor, where there was a suite of windowless rooms. And I came in my first day, and they sent me into sort of this windowless closet inside the suite of windowless rooms with like a hanging light bulb and a big stack of papers on a table. And they said,
you were like, this is where the magic happens.
I had no idea. Why don't you look through these papers and see if there's anything that's relevant? Okay, what are the papers? Well, these are profs notes written among people in the National Security Council staff and the CIA and other places. Who knows what a profs note is?
Oh.
Anyone? So what's a prof note? Well, it's this new technology, and it allows people to send electronic messages to each other over computers. And it turns out, I may get the history wrong, and Jonathan will correct me, but I think that IBM developed one of the first email platforms, and it was sold into the government, and it was used by the national security community to communicate with each other.
The Profs All-in-One System, it was called.
Is that so? Yes. He's my truth check. We'll footnote this later. But in any event, so it turned out that I was sitting there with this huge pile of papers, and it was all these printed out emails that were written between some of these names you might remember: Ollie North, Bud McFarlane, and John Poindexter, who were the two national security advisors, senior people at the CIA. And so, wow, here I am looking through all these documents. And in those days, they thought when you pressed delete, it really meant delete. And so, yes, that whole thing was not an example of what I would consider good public decision making in an area that involved secret, national security and secrecy. And it is one of the hardest challenges in government to get that balance right. And new technologies make the challenges even harder.
It was the atmosphere among the staff and the members of Congress who were working on the committee. How much of it was a partisan, one group had the back of the administration that matched their party, the other didn't. If it had been flipped, it would have been flipped, versus, wow, we need to get to the bottom of this?
So it had elements both of partisanship and nonpartisanship, and it really varied, as it often does in Congress, with the individual. And I've just found over my time in Washington that at any given time, you'll see members of either party who are highly partisan, and then you'll see members of both parties who are less partisan and will follow the issues where they go. I do think one of the trends over time is that there are more members of Congress in the partisan bucket and fewer in the middle. And that's very dangerous, in my opinion. But at the time, that was the case. There was some element, we could spend the whole time on Iran-Contra, but another fact pattern at the time was, there was an issue on the side of the then administration on whether to back or to distance themselves from the people who were clearly involved in the potential law violations. And there was a group of people on that side who thought these are our people, we should back them all the way, and there were others who saw advantage in distancing themselves from them. And so those were part of the dynamics.
Question of loyalty and how much you they're my family, even if they're not maybe the best folks.
Yeah, and you see that come up, it's come up in pardon issues over time. And it's another interesting topic, which is the question of loyalty in a democracy, in people in different governmental positions, and how to balance the role of loyalty, the responsibility of the position, and then also the accountability to the public and how much of that is direct versus indirect, right? The president is really the only person, and the vice president are the only people in the federal government who are elected. Everyone else reports up to the president, and then you have independent agencies like the FCC that are independent. So these issues come up a lot, although I have to say, in my case, when I was at the FCC, the central issues that came up were more along the lines of similar to the kinds of thinking we did in business. What are we trying to accomplish? Why are we trying to accomplish it? What are the big ideas that can help us get there? Once we have the big ideas, how do we get them done? And I did find, and so to me, kind of politics and coalition building and other things were inputs into that. I think one is often better off, is more able to manage politics and partisanship if that's the sequencing, right? The alternative sequencing is the political solution is X, whether political is defined as ideological or as maximizing the number of people who will be happy if we do Y, and then backing into a decision. And that does happen, and I think it's exactly backwards. It's exactly backwards even if your goal is to be successful politically.
So you ended up heading to law school.
Yes.
And chose Harvard.
Yes, twice. Because what happened was, so I applied to law school. I don't even know if you know this. I applied to law school out of Columbia, got in, deferred, and went to Washington and worked for Chuck Schumer, and that was fun. And then I was having so much fun, I requested a second deferment, and it was granted. And then the Iran-Contra job came along, and I requested a third deferment, and it was denied. And of course, my parents thought this was obvious, which is go to Harvard Law School. You know, this is, you found the parking spot, just take it.
I love that now the rebellious streak comes out, and I'm going to work for the Iran-Contra Committee.
So I did. So I said no thank you to Harvard. I went to work for the Harvard Iran-Contra Committee, and it was great. And then I reapplied, and fortunately I got back in. I came here. I did learn, I'll tell you one important lesson I learned at the time. One of the people who worked on the committee staff, he was the deputy chief counsel on the minority side, so on the Republican side. And he was older than me. He had been to law school, for one thing. You know, the staff worked closely together, both sides, and most of it was joint efforts. There was some partisanship in there. Anyway, he had found out about this story, and he became very interested in, he really wanted me to go to law school, he wanted me to go to Harvard, and he started spending a lot of time giving me advice, you know, both on how to get back in and ultimately how to succeed in law school. And he really spent quite a lot of time with me, and gave me really just great advice. Gave me, among other things, I remember to this day, he gave me a copy of the Bramble Bush. Has anyone here read the Bramble Bush? You know what, it's such a wonderful book to read while you're in law school. I encourage you to read it. And I asked him at one point, you know, at the end of this, like I was leaving, going off to law school, and I said, why did you spend so much time giving me advice? You have a family and you have a job and everything else. And he said, you know, early in my career, someone did this for me. And when I went to that person and said, how can I thank you? That person said, do it for someone else. And so I've always remembered that. I've tried to do it for other people. That person who helped me, his name is Richard Leon, and he's now a judge on the federal district court in Washington. Has had some major rulings. At the time, he was a young lawyer on the Iran-Contra Committee staff. But it was a wonderful experience, and it's something I've tried to remember. I don't remember how we got onto that, though.
How did you find law school?
I liked law school a lot. I really did. I think it helped that I had 3 years off, and I think that that's becoming a little bit more of the norm than it may have been then. You know, it can be easy in law school to become completely theoretical, and it's nice to be able to think about the relationship with the theory and the analytics and real-world application, and it's just a little bit easier to do that naturally if someone has had some real-world experience. I remember when I was on Law Review and I was here, I don't know the numbers exactly, but it felt like a disproportionate number of people who made Law Review had taken some time off before law school, and that didn't surprise me. So I loved law school. I really enjoyed it, even though I ultimately decided not to be a lawyer. But
were you thinking while you were in law school, I'm going to be a lawyer? Or maybe I'm going to.
I didn't know how my career. I didn't know how my career would go. You know, I was. I sort of followed the path, right? And so I didn't come to law school with a plan. I didn't come to law school thinking I'd make law review. I got lucky. I made law review. Having made law review, I thought, oh, you know, it makes sense to be a law clerk. I'll try to do that. Not everyone in law school with me had that point of view. You know, Barack Obama was in my law school class, and we were on law review together. He, of course, made the decision not to apply for clerkships. And I'll tell you a story. He got a call during clerkship season from the person who was chief judge of the DC Circuit Court of Appeals at the time. His name was Abner, still is, Abner Mikva. He's alive, and he's 88 now, wonderful man. Friends with Martha's dad, also a great man. And Judge Mikva called up Barack Obama and said, you know, I've heard a lot about you, and you know, one of my clerks knows you, and you're from Chicago, I'm from Chicago. This would be a great fit. I'd love to offer you a clerkship with me. The only problem is I noticed you haven't applied. And
that still happens all the time today.
And you know, and Barack said, oh, listen, thank you so much for calling, and you know, yes, it's true, I haven't applied. Because I've decided I don't want to clerk. I want to go back to Chicago and start rolling up my sleeves and helping in the community. Now, this would be a really great story if the next sentence was, but there's this really great guy named Julius, and you should go hire him. It's not exactly what he said. He did say, you know, there are a lot of smart people here. I'm sure you'll find someone good. But I did end up clerking for Judge Mikva in the seat that would have been occupied by him if he wanted it. And which, you know, he has a very good memory. And when he first decided to run for the Senate in 2003, we had stayed in touch and we had stayed friends. And he called me up. I remember it was over the summer. He called me up and he said, "Look," he said, "this is my moment. I'm gonna run for the Senate. I'd really like you to help me." And there was maybe 2 seconds of silence. I guess he thought I was thinking about it. He said, "Hey, you owe me for that clerkship." I said, "What? No." So anyway, but I did start helping him back then, and that's been a fabulous experience.
And this might be a good time to ask, while we're on the topic of Barack Obama, in the present day, there's some word among the Washington intelligentsia about the Green Lantern theory of leadership, the kind of superhero theory that says if you just could exert enough glowing leadership around yourself, you could make great things happen. And there's more the president could and should be doing on that sort of leadership front. And others say, no, it's more of a story about the tectonics of the situation. Name anybody you thought was a great leader, and you'll see how the fundamentals were already there to make it happen, and the leader just sort of puts it over the top. I don't know if you have either a view on one side or the other of that, and also whether, when you knew him here, was there that sort of superhero aura? We hear a number of our faculty colleagues say, Barack Obama, you know, he was my research assistant for 10 minutes, but boy, I can tell this is someone special.
So, you know, a couple points. One is, this is an extraordinary law school. And you know, one goes immediately to Garrison Keillor, and you know, everyone here is well above average, and so I felt that it was a privilege to be here, and every single person you know I met here was extraordinary, and over the years I've stayed in touch with many of them, and that continues to be true. And so many people from my class are doing things to change the world in different ways. It is also the case that those of us on Law Review, not forced by anyone, elected Barack Obama president of the Law Review. There were many very talented people on the Law Review, and it was a somewhat competitive race, but the truth is it was largely a consensus decision at the end of the day, and we all recognized, people from different backgrounds and ideologies, that he was the right leader and the leader in that group. So I always had just tremendous respect for his intellect, his judgment, his heart. I think we all did, and I think it's kind of amazing to see it play out historically. I don't know that anyone expected that, just because of the odds of that actually happening. I do think on your question about, you know, we live in a time of sort of intense and I want to choose my words carefully here, but somewhat nutty public dialogue over every public issue. I saw that in my job as the FCC, and that was a tiny fraction of what the president has to deal with. And there's a way in which that's both worse than it's ever been, and that has to do, I think, with issues like congressional redistricting. It has to do with issues like the fragmentation of media, first through cable and then through the internet. But it's also the case, as anyone here who's read history knows, that we've treated almost every one of our presidents really badly during their time in office. I'm proud and impressed of what this president has accomplished so far, and it's not over. I believe history will remember him for, at a minimum, ending the war in Iraq, getting us out of Afghanistan, saving the country from the brink of what would have been a deep, tragic, and painful economic collapse, doing something revolutionary around providing health care to millions of healthcare insurance to millions of Americans who don't have it, and putting us on our track to having a more economically sustainable and effective healthcare system. I personally think that the progress the country has made around wired and wireless broadband will, be part of his legacy, but we'll see about that. And I think there's still the opportunity to have, additional major accomplishments in the next few years. But even if we stop right here and you compared that list to almost any other president for a very long time, it's a very impressive list, and done in an environment that I think is much harder than the past. I have tremendous respect for Lyndon Johnson, and some of the things that he did really amazing. But he had, many more people in Congress who were willing to cross party lines. The parties in those periods were in a complicated period of transition. He had more tools and levers than a modern president has. And notwithstanding that, he didn't last a second term. And I think this president's accomplishments, including getting reelected, and then what he's doing in the second term, will go down in history as an amazing thing.
Now, you've seen this administration at work from before it became an administration. You were involved in the campaign and then in the transition. Love to hear a little bit more about that, and include possibly the sense of, in your zone of technology and telecoms, what appetite there was to do what at the moment of transition when everything was still possibility, compared with the reality of actually having to make stuff happen.
Consistent with my ongoing luck in sort of being the Zelig of by the way, has anyone here seen Zelig? This is
Forrest Gump.
What is it when none of your cultural references are understood by anyone in the audience? Is that like time to get off the stage? So, just ignore that. So as I mentioned, I was lucky enough to know the president going back to law school. We stayed friends, and he went off in the direction that's well known, community organizer in Chicago, professor, eventually running for office. And I went from clerkships to the Federal Communications Commission, coming out of the clerkship. If we have time, I have a story there for students that I'd like to tell if there's time. And then from there, I decided to go into the technology and media world. I joined up with a company that eventually became called ISE Interactive Corps. I mentioned it, run by Barry Diller. And in various roles, I helped build that company working for Barry Diller. But I was, as a result of that, exposed to the very early days and progress of the internet, the Expedias of the world, et cetera, and also of mobile. And I developed a thesis at the time. I don't think the word thesis was in my vocabulary, but in retrospect, I'm calling it a thesis. But it was an idea, and the idea was, and the first time I mentioned this to President Obama was in 2003, ahead of his 2004 Senate race. But I remember we were just talking, and I said, every technology that's developed and perfected in the commercial space to persuade, organize, market eventually moves to politics. There's always a lag because the costs have to come down and the simplicity has to go up. And then there's often a leader who is at the head of, who makes the transition happen. And so for radio, it was FDR. For TV, it was JFK. For direct marketing, it was Ronald Reagan. And I said to Barack Obama in 2003, I said, this is going to happen with the internet. And why not you? So he nodded, and as he was doing his 2003 Senate race, it really wasn't that relevant. And in fact, the cost and simplicity of commercial internet tools hadn't gotten to the right place. But then I happened to be around as he was thinking about running for president, and I reminded him of this and the little team that was thinking about his race. And this is now 2006, and I said, this is the moment. And it became a subject of discussion internally. And ultimately, he made the decision in the first budget to include a line item for technology. And the campaign made a very early commitment to people and tools around technology. And history was made from there. There's a very good argument that without that, the president's ability to win the primaries and maybe ultimately the general election would have been, let's say less likely. So it was fun to be involved in that and to see that play out.
Mm-hmm. So once you're running the FCC, curious how well, having worked there in another context, been in business, that first day you enter the chairman's office, how much you feel like you have a sense of how the place works and how to get through the day. And maybe in addition to that, all of us subscribe to the idea of risk-taking and learning from failure, but when there's actually a real risk we're about to take, we often pull back. Curious if there is an early failure or a risk you took that you might not regret, but that did materialize, and how that maybe set you up for what you did next.
It's a good question. So let me tell the story about ending up at the FCC in 1994 when people thought that was a little bit kooky. So I went here like you, and I was lucky enough to clerk, and I realized as I was clerking that I wasn't sure I wanted to be, take that back, because my first thinking was the recognition that I didn't think I wanted to be a litigator. And the view that, law school, at least then, did a great job of teaching kind of legal process, and a lot of the funneling, at least my experience was, to litigation jobs, not all of them. But even on the kind of corporate deal side, it's still the process piece of it. And I realized at some point that I didn't want to be that kind of lawyer. There's nothing wrong with it, and there's some great lawyers who do that, and I think it's fantastic, and they're essential parts of our ecosystem. But I thought, that's not where I'm going to have the most fun. And I began to think, as my clerkship was winding up, that I would have more fun as a lawyer and maybe as a non-lawyer if I picked a subject matter specialty. And so I spent some time thinking about, all right, what subject matters would I want to specialize in? And what would be fun, and where could you have a fun career if you become an expert in a subject rather than in legal process of some sort? And I'm not being fair to the legal process side of it, and I recognize that. But the other side I offer because it's just one way to think about career. And I thought about it, and I thought about some different things. I thought about energy, I thought about labor and employment. But I quickly came to think about communications, partly because my father was an engineer. I was a little bit of a geek. And it just hit me that, wow, this is an area that's just packed with fun. Great legal issues, whether they're First Amendment issues, administrative law issues, public policy issues, just things of interest to me as a human being. I use these products in my life. I always liked it. And you could have a career, I thought, where you could do all sorts of different things, depending on what opportunities arose and what was fun. And so then I thought, all right, well, that makes sense. I should specialize in something. Communication sounds like something to specialize in. What am I going to do now? And totally by coincidence, around the time I was going through this thinking, an email came around to the law clerks from a deputy SG named Chris Wright. Do you know Chris? Chris had just left the SG's office to become deputy general counsel at the FCC. He sent around an email saying, hey, anyone want to come over here? And I said, all right, yeah, that's a good idea.
Meet you at the YMCA.
And so we had coffee, and then I ended up getting introduced to the general counsel, Bill Kennard, who later became chairman, and the chairman at the time, Reed Hunt. And before I knew it, I was working at the FCC, and it was the smartest, luckiest decision I ever made. And I loved that period of time. I came out of it thinking that I wanted to move to the business side, and that's ultimately what I did. I took the job in New York. But the reason I mention it is that when I got back to the FCC on my first day, I was very, very lucky in having had by accident what I think was a really good set of experiences to be ready to tackle the job in day one. So one, I had been at the agency. I understood how it worked. I understood how the community worked. That was helpful. Two, I had spent a long time in the private sector. I understood that part of the issues that the FCC was dealing with, but I also had learned a lot about leadership, management, organization, motivation in the private sector. And I'd also worked on the Hill, for Iran-Contra I mentioned, but incredibly talented people like Chuck Schumer, and I learned a lot from Chuck Schumer about how to get things done. And the truth is that was really great training to hit the ground running on day one. I don't know how Martha's father did it at age 34, never having worked in government at that point. You come in and you're dealing with a lot of repeat players who know a lot more than you do about a lot of things that matter, and you can get into a lot of trouble because of the information disadvantage. So I feel really lucky that I had that, and during my confirmation process, I had some time to prepare, and so I felt like I had been well prepared, and that if I messed it up, it would be my own fault. I literally, there would be no one else to blame. And I'm not sure what that means for people here, but I've had diversity in my career that's been just great. And each of the things that I've done, I've learned lessons from, or at least I've tried to, that applied to the next thing. And that's been fun.
Last question before we open it to the floor about the failure piece of things.
Yeah. I guess here's how I look at it. When I was at IAC, we did a lot of deals. We bought a lot of companies. Not all those acquisitions worked out. Some worked out spectacularly well. Not all worked out. And one of the things that I learned is that, in a job where you're actually doing stuff, failure is inevitable. And in fact, I learned a very important lesson from Barry Diller, who was my boss at the time, who would say, if you're not making mistakes, you're not doing anything. And mistakes were never penalized at IAC. What was looked for was, do people recognize their mistakes on their own? And do they learn from them? Can they articulate what they've learned from them? And can they make adjustments in what they're doing to decrease the chances of mistakes in the future? And that was really important learning for me, and also a very helpful frame for coming into a job like the FCC, or the one I have now at Carlyle. Mistakes are a part of life. It's natural for mistakes to freeze people, and it's natural for people like all of you who've done well enough to get into a school like Harvard Law School, and who may never have made a mistake in your life, to be scared to death of mistakes. And I guess my message is, don't be afraid of mistakes. Recognize them before other people do, and learn something from them, and be able to tell people about it. And it's fine. You'll find that people are fine with that. And it's true in an organization, whether you're talking up or talking down. It's true with the American public. Yeah. I think we understand as a democratic people that, of course, our leaders aren't going to get everything right. I think we're looking for the same thing in our leaders. Do you know you've made a mistake? Are you recognizing it, or do we have to tell you? What are you doing about it?
Let's open it up to questions. There's a microphone in the back and one in the front, and probably a good time to warn people that this is being recorded and anything could happen. There's also a camera there in addition to the recording that's probably taking place. And we will have a hard stop at 1 for people to be able to get to classes and such. Oh. Here. We specialize in a full service. Feel free to tell us who you are.
Great. I'm a third year at the law school. Thanks so much for being here. I was interested in a recent decision you were involved in as the head of the FCC. What were your thoughts around the Light Squared case, and what do you think the right outcome should be for the parties there?
So let me take a step back and explain what the question was about. One of the early challenges that we identified at the FCC in 2009 as a potential threat to our innovation economy was the lack of sufficient spectrum to power our mobile devices, right? So we all have these devices, and it turns out that these devices put a tremendous demand on the airwaves, on the spectrum. Just to give you some numbers, a typical smartphone will put demand on spectrum that's not 10% or 50% or 100% more than the BlackBerries you used before, but 25 times more. And a tablet put on a network will put a demand that's about 150 times more. And here's what doesn't happen when you're chairman of the FCC. They don't say, oh, welcome, sir. Let us take you to the warehouse where we keep the spectrum that we haven't put on the market yet so that you can put it out there and be a hero. That doesn't happen. And in fact, when I got to the FCC, the spectrum cupboard was bare. At exactly the time that Steve Jobs and AT&T were introducing the iPhone, they were working on the tablet. And so this is a major problem. It remains a major problem. And we organized a lot of our work at the FCC to try to free up much more spectrum than had been planned for mobile broadband, and to do both licensed and unlicensed, which we probably don't have time to get into now, but is an important concept. And we pursued simultaneously a number of ideas that went in public perception from being crazy ideas to being, oh, that was smart. One was a new incentive auction concept to reallocate spectrum from over-the-air broadcast TV to mobile broadband. Another was to dramatically increase the amount and type of unlicensed spectrum, which is the kind of spectrum we use for Wi-Fi. Third was to think much more creatively about spectrum sharing between government users and commercial users to get more efficient use and more innovation for both commercial users and for our military. And another category of idea was looking for areas of spectrum use where we could remove unnecessary restrictions on spectrum use and therefore free up those bands of spectrum for mobile broadband. And one of the areas we identified was satellite spectrum, and there's a lot of spectrum that's dedicated for satellite usage. For a satellite to work, there needs to be an earth station on the ground that beams up, and and then the satellite beams back down, either to the earth station, it may go to other places. And we thought, wow, there are going to be ways where we can say, hey, satellite folks, continue to use that spectrum, but it's also usable for terrestrial or ground-based mobile, and everyone wins. And so we pursued that strategy in a number of different places. And in most cases, that strategy was successful. And so there's a significant amount of spectrum that's now on the market for terrestrial use that's helping to relieve mobile spectrum congestion that wasn't there before. One of the areas that's still in process is the one that you asked about. And it involves a band of spectrum called the L band. It doesn't really matter so much. But it turns out in that particular band, as we tried to do this, while the satellite terrestrial problem had been solved, there was another problem involving interference with GPS use that created problems that were much more difficult to solve. And so that was one where we weren't able to solve it in my tenure. FCC continues to work on solving that, and it's in our collective interest to see that solved so that that spectrum also can be used in the most efficient way, while obviously making sure that we have functioning GPS that's not interfered with by other uses.
I guess part of the reputation of that problem was that a number of companies that built GPSs had not built them as precisely as they should have and had promised, such that the interference would happen in practice, if not in theory, and that then the question was who holds the bag
Yes.
on the status quo for that.
Absolutely, there were some really important learnings coming out of that. You know, in a perfectly efficiently organized spectrum map, everyone's incentives would work out well. In this case, you know, if you imagine a band where satellite is allowed but nothing else is allowed, and in the neighboring band GPS is allowed. Let's do it the other way. If there's a GPS band and next to it there's a terrestrial mobile use, if one started to interfere with the other, there would be yelling and shouting, and the FCC would get involved and solve it. If one band is satellite only and the other band has GPS, or it could be other, this has come up with wireless mics and other technologies, and there's no terrestrial use, you can naturally get encroachment that then becomes difficult to solve, particularly if those products are in use and on the market and used by consumers and public safety. So it becomes a hard problem to solve.
Mindful of the time, let's have one more question. Who wants to? Aha, Mary Catherine.
My name is Mary Catherine. I'm a third-year JD MBA student. Given your experience working with both Supreme Court justices and Barry Diller, I can't help but ask what you think of the current Aereo case, and what you think, maybe if not with respect to the specific decision, but what you think the optimal multi-channel video ecosystem might be for consumers.
Yep. So I was at the argument yesterday, and it was really interesting. One of the things that I noticed was that the justices were very sophisticated about technology and very focused on the potential consequences to the new digital economy by whatever they do in the case. You know, cloud computing came up over and over again. And other terms that, you know, say 10 years ago would not have naturally come from the bench in a Supreme Court argument. And I thought that was a very good and healthy thing. I agree with the folks who've said that based on the argument, the case is too close to call, and I've been in enough arguments from the other side to realize that that's probably the case. On your second question about how video programming should evolve, you know, we benefit always from competition, and I continue to think that the internet provides unique opportunities to allow for a kind of competition that would have been unimaginable before the internet. You know, it's why for me, when I was in office, working very hard on the net neutrality issue and trying to get it right was so important. I'm sure that'll continue to be the case, but the more open the internet pipe is into the home to innovators and new entrants, the more likely we'll see over time more choices to consumers, more competition throughout the video landscape. I do think we, you know, in some ways we, one of the things that happens in this space is that there are good developments that happen that we don't notice until we look back. And an example of it is the way that kind of cable TV went from non-existing to all of a sudden, you know, supplying so many channels in all of our homes. And I think the internet is already providing just really interesting products and services around video, and we're at a moment in time that's going to get even more exciting.
Before we adjourn, Martha's going to say a little something, and I just wanted to say one of the elusive qualities to understand is leadership. And for my part, having served some time as a visiting scholar at the FCC under your chairmanship, one of the things I learned was your brand of leadership, which is probably captured by the phrase you used earlier, packed with fun. And the way in which the staff, thousands of people, were so tuned to the fun you were having, to the goal you could elucidate and explain why this mattered, and the way in which it made their desire to move your agenda along intrinsic. It was something they really wanted to do, not because they were afraid they'd get fired if they didn't do it, or something like that. And that's been really fun to see.
Well, can I just say one thing, because you're so nice to say that. That's the official version of what happened. The truth is, what happened is that the one correct thing I did was that I reached out to people like Jonathan And I said, can you please do your part to help us get this right for the country? And the truth is, none of these governmental processes can work unless a few different things happen. One of them is really talented, open-minded people from the academy, from the private sector, from other places to participate in government processes. I feel so strongly about this. You know, it's our government, it's our democracy. It's perfectly fine to criticize it, and we all should. But I really do think we all have obligations as citizens to do our part to help, whether it's doing a turn through government or as someone on the outside, and Martha Minow has done this as well, putting some of your time to help people in government succeed. And so, Jonathan, thank you for that. You played a very big and important role.
Well, thank you. Over to our dean.
A personal comment and then a general comment. The personal one is, I think I'm dean because Julius Genachowski said to me, we're at a moment, an inflection moment, a moment of change. You should be part of it, as I was deciding whether or not to be dean. So thank you very much for maybe we'll talk about that later. But the other thing I want to say is that Stephen and Maureen Klinsky had this idea that the law school should be opening up for students here a vista of things to do that are far beyond what you tend to see from OCS. And I can't imagine a better person to exemplify that than Julius Genachowski. So as our inaugural professor of leadership, the Stephen Maureen Klinsky professorship, I hope you'll join me in encouraging Julius to come back early and often. Thank you, Julius.
Thank you very much. Thank you for doing that.